There is a moment in every lost war when defeat is no longer a possibility, but a certainty. It doesn't arrive with a surrender or a headline. It arrives quietly in briefing rooms, on maps, and in the minds of those who understand how wars are actually fought. For Nazi Germany, that moment did not come in 1945, among the ruins of Berlin. It came much earlier. And the first people to understand it were not civilians, not even Adolf Hitler himself. They were the German generals. These men were trained to think in logistics, timelines, fuel, manpower, and geography. They knew that wars are not won by speeches or belief, but by resources and reality. And slowly, as the war expanded across Europe and into the Soviet Union, they began to see something deeply troubling. Germany was no longer moving toward victory. It was being pulled into a war it could not finish. In the early years, Germany appeared unstoppable. Poland collapsed, France fell in weeks, and much of Europe stood helpless before the German army. To the outside world, the war looked already decided. But inside the German high command, confidence was quietly eroding. Everything changed with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The plan was simple and absolute. A rapid campaign, collapsed enemy, a short war in the east. But by July, the plan was already breaking apart. Soviet units that should have surrendered continued to fight. Encircled armies did not disappear. Losses mounted, distances grew, and time began working against Germany instead of for it. German generals noticed the shift immediately. Reports from the front described resistance that did not weaken, but hardened. Casualties were rising faster than expected. Vehicles were wearing out. Supply lines were stretching across vast territories with no end in sight. This was not the kind of war Germany had prepared for. A dictator believes in willpower. A general believes in numbers. And the numbers were starting to tell a different story. By late summer 1941, it was becoming clear to many senior officers that even if Germany continued winning battles, it might still lose the war. The idea of a quick victory was gone. In its place stood a grinding conflict of attrition, something Germany could not afford. The winter of 1941 brought the first undeniable shock. Outside Moscow, German forces were stopped. Then they were pushed back. For the first time, the German army was no longer advancing. It was holding on. Inside command meetings, the tone changed. Victory was mentioned less often. Survival took its place. Withdrawals were discussed in private, even if they were forbidden in public. Many generals understood what could not be spoken aloud. The war had passed a point where it could be decisively won. Hitler, however, refused to accept this reality. Where his generals saw limits, he saw betrayal. Where they spoke of logistics, he spoke of will. A dangerous divide opened between those who fought the war and the man who commanded it. From this moment on, Germany was fighting two wars at the same time. One against the Allies on the battlefield, and another against reality itself. And when experienced generals begin to understand that a war is already lost, every order feels different. Every sacrifice weighs heavier, because the question is no longer how to win, but how much destruction will be demanded before the end is allowed to come. By 1942. The gap between what Hitler believed and what his generals knew had become impossible to hide. On paper, Germany still looked powerful. Its armies occupied enormous territories. Its enemies had suffered staggering losses. To the public, the image of strength remained intact. But behind closed doors, the calculations were growing darker. The campaign in the Soviet Union had turned into something Germany was never designed to fight. The distances were too vast, the enemy too resilient, the demands on manpower and fuel too great. German officers understood that modern war was not decided by courage alone. It was decided by production, replacement rates, and endurance. And in all three, Germany was falling behind. The summer offensive of 1942 was driven less by confidence than by necessity. The push toward the Caucasus oil fields was not a gamble for glory. It was an admission. Without oil, the war could not continue. Several generals recognized this for what it was: a final attempt to force a strategic solution before the imbalance became fatal. As German forces moved deeper into southern Russia, Warning signs multiplied. Supply lines stretched thinner. Coordination weakened. Entire formations were locked into positions they could not easily abandon. Still, orders came to press forward. Still, retreats were forbidden. And still, many commanders obeyed, even as they privately understood the risk. Then came Stalingrad. At first, it appeared to be another hard battle in a long campaign. But as Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army, the truth became unavoidable. An entire field army, hundreds of thousands of men, was trapped with no realistic chance of rescue. Generals knew what that meant. No modern army could absorb such a loss and recover. From that moment, the language inside the German command structure changed completely. Officers stopped speaking about decisive victory. Instead, they spoke about holding lines, buying time, preventing collapse. Some still hoped for a negotiated outcome. Others understood that even that was unlikely. Hitler's response was not adaptation, but denial. He forbade withdrawals, rejected relief attempts that required flexibility, and insisted that willpower could overcome encirclement, hunger, and winter. To the generals, this was no longer strategy. It was fantasy. When the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, it marked more than a military defeat. It marked the psychological breaking point. For many German commanders, this was the moment the war crossed from difficult to unwinnable. Germany no longer had the reserves, the freedom of movement, or the strategic options needed to reverse the situation. Yet the fighting continued. Orders were issued. Plans were drawn. But the meaning had changed. The generals were no longer planning how to win the war. They were planning how to manage decline. From this point on, every offensive was defensive in spirit. Every success was temporary. Every loss carried consequences that could not be repaired. The war had become a matter of delay, not decision. And still, no one could say it openly. To admit the war was lost was to invite accusation, dismissal, or worse. So the truth remained unspoken, circulating only in private conversations, glances over maps, and the growing silence in briefing rooms where confidence once ruled. The German generals understood something that could no longer be undone. The war was continuing, but its outcome was already set. And from here on, the only question left was not whether Germany would lose, but how long the destruction would continue before reality finally imposed itself. At a certain point in the war, something shifted inside the minds of German generals. Not on the battlefield, not on the maps, but internally. They still had troops, still had weapons, still had commands to issue, but deep down they already knew. The war was lost, even if no one was allowed to say it out loud. This wasn't fear. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives too late. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel was rationed to absurd levels. Orders coming from Berlin no longer matched reality on the ground. Entire strategies were being planned on paper while cities burned faster than reports could reach headquarters. And yet, the commands kept coming. Attack here. Hold this position. Advance tomorrow. Generals looked at these orders and understood something terrifying. Obedience no longer meant victory. It meant sacrifice without purpose. Men were being sent forward not to win, but to delay the inevitable days, maybe hours. Some officers began to notice patterns. When reality contradicted command, command always won. Not because it was correct, but because questioning it had become more dangerous than the enemy itself. The system no longer rewarded truth, it punished it. This is where wars truly end. Not when the last shot is fired, but when leaders privately accept defeat while publicly demanding loyalty. Many German generals were trapped in this moment. They knew the numbers. They saw the losses. They understood the industrial imbalance. The Allies could replace tanks, planes, and soldiers faster than Germany could replace hope. Every week made the outcome clearer. And still, retreat was forbidden. Adaptation was labeled weakness. Reality became treason. What's chilling is how quiet this realization was. No dramatic announcements. No mass resignations. Just silence. A silence filled with compliance. Orders were followed not because they made sense, but because refusing them meant execution, disgrace, or imprisonment. The war machine had turned inward. It no longer fought the enemy, it fought doubt. Some generals later admitted that by 1944, their role had changed. They were no longer commanders seeking victory. They were managers of collapse. Their decisions weren't about winning the war, but about choosing where the damage would fall next. And this is the part history rarely talks about, because this story isn't only about Germany. It's about what happens when systems become more important than truth, when loyalty is valued above reason, when authority demands obedience even after it has lost legitimacy. This moment, when intelligent people continue following commands they know are wrong, is not unique to war. It appears in governments, corporations, institutions, and even everyday life. The uniforms change. The stakes look smaller. But the psychology is identical. People don't fail because they're evil. They fail because they stop questioning. The German generals understood the war was lost long before the surrender. But understanding something privately doesn't change outcomes. Acting on it does. And when action becomes impossible, collapse becomes inevitable. And once collapse becomes inevitable, something even darker begins to happen. Responsibility dissolves. Each person tells himself the same lie. I'm just following orders. Someone else will decide. Someone else will stop this. But no one does. Inside command rooms, maps were still updated, arrows still drawn, plans still announced with confidence. On paper, everything looked organized. In reality, it was theater, a performance meant to preserve the illusion of control long after control had vanished. This is how systems die slowly, not with chaos but with procedure. Many generals stopped asking if an order made sense and started asking only how fast it could be executed. Speed replaced strategy. Compliance replaced intelligence. And the war dragged on, not because victory was possible, but because stopping required courage the system no longer allowed. What terrified some officers wasn't defeat itself. It was the realization that the structure they served could no longer be corrected from within. Feedback loops were broken. Bad news was filtered out before it reached the top. Reality was edited to protect egos. By the time truth arrived, it was already too late to matter. There's a moment in every failing system when truth becomes dangerous. When the person who speaks honestly is treated as a threat, not a warning. That moment had passed. By late stages of the war, entire units were sacrificed for symbolic reasons. Hold this city not because it can be held, but because abandoning it would admit failure. Defend this line not because it matters militarily, but because retreat would break the narrative. Narratives became more important than lives. And here's what's uncomfortable. Most of this didn't require fanatics. It required normal, educated, disciplined men doing what they had been trained to do: obey. Obedience is powerful. It builds armies, creates order. But when obedience detaches from reality, it becomes lethal. The same mechanism that creates efficiency can also create catastrophe. Some generals later described a strange emotional numbness. When every decision leads to loss, you stop feeling. You stop weighing consequences. You just execute. The moral burden is transferred upward, even when you know the top is disconnected from reality. This is how people survive inside collapsing systems, by shrinking their sense of responsibility until it fits inside a command. And yet, history doesn't judge systems. It judges outcomes. When the war finally ended, many claimed ignorance. Many claimed powerlessness. Many claimed they had no choice. But the tragedy is that the choice point existed. It was just earlier, quieter, and far more uncomfortable. The war was lost not only on the battlefield, but in the moment questioning stopped. And that's the warning buried inside this story. Because the real danger isn't blind obedience. It's comfortable obedience. The kind that feels normal. The kind that feels safe. The kind that convinces intelligent people to suspend their judgment just long enough for disaster to become irreversible. And this is why this story still matters. Not because of uniforms, flags, or ideologies, but because it reveals a pattern that repeats whenever authority replaces reality. The German generals didn't lose the war in a single decision. They lost it through a series of silent moments where obedience felt easier than truth, and conformity felt safer than responsibility. History often asks, how could this happen? The uncomfortable answer is, it happens slowly, and it happens quietly. It happens when people trust systems more than facts, when questioning is seen as disloyalty, when following orders becomes a moral shield. By the time collapse is visible to everyone, the real failure has already happened long before. The war ended when the fighting stopped, but it was lost the moment critical thinking was surrendered. That is the lesson, because every generation believes it would act differently. Every system believes it is immune, and every collapse begins with the same assumption. Someone else will stop this. No one does, and that's why remembering this moment isn't about the past. It's about recognizing the warning signs before obedience turns into catastrophe again.